So, sorry about that. That's okay. That's okay. So this is what kind of started getting me really excited about it. It's especially coming into the nonprofit world 3 years ago. It showed me, I wondered, like, you know, what does a social scientist bring to nonprofits? And what I've landed on personally is this tool of programmatic evaluation and this ability to bring research into not just hold research in the ivory tower, but actually share research skills so that people can use them to better their programming. In the innovation lab, we pilot programs that address root causes of food insecurity in Vermont. And part of piloting those programs was developing intricate assessment plans in order to tell, like, do these things actually address these root causes? Are these little small pilots scalable to the statewide organization? And so we're kind of in that process right now at the lab of bringing all that data together and figuring out what the lessons are. So yeah. Oh yeah, we already kind of went around, but I'm curious about this concept of programmatic assessment, like what folks' experience is, and also, like, do you have something very tangible you're hoping to get out of this workshop today? So yeah, I just want to put that to the group.
Yeah. I mean, I think something I'm really interested in is kind of like demystifying or breaking down some of the elements of program and like project assessment. Like, I think it can feel really daunting when you have this broad question of like, what are we doing? What impact are we having? And so I think kind of taking it piece by piece and looking more at like how you actually craft the pieces to put together is helpful. Just because there's so much you could look at, and I feel like that makes it a little intimidating to be like, how do you even get started? So.
I guess I would say for me is our organization started during the pandemic, so we were addressing an emergency. And so now we're transitioning to something different. And so in a sense, we're kind of like a blank slate on where can we take this? So we're still at the point where we're doing exactly what we were doing during the pandemic. So we're trying to learn, like, what impact has that had? And what are the other needs in the community? So, but as an educator myself, because I work in higher ed at the law school, I'm also super interested in Bloom's taxonomy because I have not developed some very good assessments for the work I do, and I really would love to do that.
Yeah, totally. Oh, yeah, and I could talk about that a lot. And I think that, Monica, what you're talking about in terms of the pandemic and your organization kind of coming out of it, I think even for organizations that are longstanding, like the one I work at, the Vermont Food Bank, the terrain totally shifted during the pandemic, and a lot of programs were created or changed in ways that now they're continuing in that regard. And it's a moment of kind of taking a deep breath, looking back. Are these changes where we want to be going? What does it mean? Are we in a constant food emergency now? So, you know, I think that your experience in some ways is one that a lot of organizations are grappling with.
Yeah, I have fairly limited experience, and our group is a group of volunteers that is fairly new since the pandemic. And yeah, I feel like there's so much energy and excitement kind of like going into like what we're doing, and like pulling that off feels like such a feat with our like limited bandwidth essentially. So yeah, it always gets assessment. It's a conversation that we have, you know, let's try to like gather this data, but like, yeah, there's I think a lack of understanding how to do that effectively and not lose steam by the end of it, right? But I'm really interested in trying to fine tune, you know, some of that, like all of this kind of backgrounds behind the scenes structure to build upon.
Yeah, and right sizing is going to be critical because we could have you know, the minutes to every single meeting, for example, as part of our data set, but does anyone have the time to read back through the minutes of every single meeting and, you know, do some analysis of that? So yeah, I think that it's gonna be important to think about what is doable. But hopefully through this workshop, we'll get you into that sweet spot of something that feels doable, but also hits right at like the main goals of what you want to assess. Any folks on
Anyone
Zoom,
online
sir?
wanna?
I'm happy to jump in. Yes, well, been in this role for less than a year, close to a year at this point, but still feel in a way like I'm getting my feet underneath me and trying to figure out exactly what sticks, even as far as programming goes. And so in some ways, I think today I'm kind of interested in like almost a reverse engineering approach and thinking of like, well, what sort of assessment metrics are helpful to gather, and then how can I make sure that programming that I'm doing is like serving that need to kind of make the whole strategy cohesive, I guess. Yeah, and I think also thinking about storytelling around that and what is the appropriate kind of outlet. Like an annual report would be probably pretty ambitious, but like what are other ways that might be more accessible or approachable, also less labor intensive, just thinking of legitimate bandwidth. And I do have some experience in other capacities in my job working. I work at Dartmouth College in the sustainability office also. And we are often assessing I would say largely by like participant debrief form feedback is how we do a lot of our program assessment.
Yeah, I can jump into that. I actually am writing an annual report right now, which is not the same as a grant report, which is typically where I find myself doing a lot of assessment. But the question of what the most impactful like assessment is to different audiences is a good one for me. And generally, I just want to know best practices. In a lot of my grant reporting, I'm throwing out data, I'm throwing out anecdotes, pictures, storytelling. I'm doing a lot, and just because it's all I can think to do, but maybe if there are best practices, it would just be easier for me to think about how to structure these things.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, writing annual reports, that is I think that is one way to bring program assessment to fruition. So, you know, in terms of best practices, it's used in a lot of different ways. So sometimes if it's specific to a program as opposed to a whole organization, it might be kept internal. And then, it's really great to hear about the work that's happening with sustainable Woodstock and this idea of capturing people's stories, because I think that is an incredible form of sharing back what people say about the program. Great. Oh, and Shelby, did you have anything?
Yeah, I guess just what I would add is that we are kind of unique in that like there's not really a large, like a direct population that we serve that is in large number of people. Like we have 2 land stewards that we're working with to kind of provide access to both farmland and forest land. So trying to get creative about how we can like emphasize that impact while the number of those that we're directly serving in that way is low.
Yeah, totally. Great. Thank you. So I'm gonna start with just the basics. There are a lot of different frameworks for program assessment. I like this assessment cycle, which again, it does come out of educational assessment, but it gets at the most important thing about assessment is that it is iterative. And so was that Genevera, is that right? Ginevra, yeah, thank you. As Ginevra was, you pointed out, so clearly, there's so many reasons why we do it, such as grant reporting, annual reporting, evaluating specific programs, but it also can be part of a process of organizational reflection and transformation. I think that when it's working best, it's something that is part of kind of the movement of the organization throughout the year. So a report being kind of like a summation of it, but a touchstone that you can come back to and shift over time. So an iterative cyclical process, something that's reflective, I think is important. And which is a little different than this idea of an audience, because really, in some ways, the audience can be your own organization, your board, your staff, as a way to reflect back to you whether you're doing what you're trying to do. I think at its best, and also a way to change over time, like Monica, what you're saying about the pandemic and shifting over time and making sure those shifts are intentional. The metrics themselves that are generated through the assessment process are, the outcomes. They can be like, generally the word metrics is used to describe the quantitative assessments. It could be, like I was saying, acres, pounds, dollars, people served, workshops run, those sorts of measurable things. But I think they can also be qualitative, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But really, one of the most important things is that you're creating some sort of apples to apples comparison across time and programs. And there's a lot of decisions. I don't have as many answers in this workshop as I am going to just pose a lot of questions. And one of the questions I would want to pose is that if you're doing apples to apples comparison, to just think about, what are you comparing to? So for example, in a large organization, you will be comparing programs to each other potentially, but in a smaller organization, your assessment might be whole organization. Maybe you want to compare it to peer programs in the region, in the country. And that's something that one of the, I kind of like step one is really one of the things that we did in our team. That was one of our most valuable exercises, was for everyone to go out and find other reports, other annual reports, other research reports from other organizations that we consider peer organizations. How are they measuring things? Because then we can really put ourselves into that conversation where we can say, we can learn from each other. And, in a more competitive bend, if you're going for money, you can outperform each other as well. So at the beginning is the program goals, which there are a lot of ways to derive program goals. For better or worse, a lot of the time, what does that for us is our history. We tell the story of our organization, and that kind of tells the story of who we are and what we do. And history is important. For example, if you're a land access organization, it might not be a good idea to have program goals that are around, economic development or healthcare or things like that, because they go too far astray of your funding base and your mission. So history is important, as well as the existing activities being important. Again, you want your goals to be in line with what you're doing, or else they're unachievable. Funding as well is always going to shape program design for better or worse. And, this idea of grant reporting being one of the ways in which we do this assessment, because it's kind of forced out of us. We get the money, and then we have to do the assessment in order to show that we use the money in the way that we said we would. But the thing that I would like to argue is that strategic goals and the connection between day-to-day operations in the organization and the large goals in your strategy are actually, hopefully, your guiding star in terms of programmatic assessment. Like I said, in balance with all of these other things, but ideally what the assessment does is that it gives you feedback as to whether you're achieving the large goals that you say that your organization is designed to address. So I feel like this workshop comes at a good time, because you just did the strategic the strategic planning workshop. So in a lot of ways, assessment is what comes after. You make these goals, you do your strategic plan, you work with your board and your staff, and then you create this beautiful document that says that we're going to like make land available to everyone, feed everyone. Everyone's going to like get housing and healthcare. We have these big visions, and then the assessment is how you can come back to your board, to your donors, to your community, and say, this is how we moved toward this goal. And also, so you can go back to yourselves and be like, you know, we're not doing this very well. Let's use the assessment to shift our activities. Something that we've been doing in the Innovation Lab is working with advisory boards. So just a brief plug for advisory boards. It's a really great way of bringing together people who are maybe affected by the organization. So for us in the lab, some of the folks that we bring in are identity groups that we're trying to reach out to, people with lived experience of food insecurity, other organizations that are partners in our work. And you can also just work with an existing coalition. One of the projects that I'm doing works with the Lamoille Health Collaborative over in Lamoille County on their closed loop referral tool. It's like a community information network that they're trying to launch in order to create more connections between different organizations and health and food and housing and substance use organizations all talking to each other. But an advisory board is just a really great tool, I think, in this sort of assessment, because it takes the organization and it creates these accountability mechanisms and it creates new perspectives. So if you were to create an advisory board, and some people, if you're a small organization, your board of directors might be your advisory board right there. And just the importance of having these kind of groups of people engaged in the whole cyclical process of assessment. Okay. The next stage is actually our strategies. How are we going to assess what we say we want to assess? So you've made your goals. You've decided that as an organization, you're going to strive for these aims. And then you have your programs that are executing them. Well, assessment is essentially a research process. Your program goals are your research question or questions. And then you have these two kind of broad categories, which ideally, I think that you mix them up, but also it comes back to what do you have the capacity to collect in terms of data and analyze. But these two categories are qualitative and quantitative, and I already heard some of these things when we were talking a little bit at first. So qualitative, for example, is it's richer, more in-depth knowledge. So it's your interviews, focus groups, any opportunity that you have to engage with people in a deep way and hear what they have to say. And you find out kind of like richer experiences that you can use in different ways, but storytelling is a great way to use that information. It kind of like colors the story and makes it humanizing and helps people understand the experience of those affected by the programming. And then quantitative is also incredibly valuable. Quantitative is just the numbers that you're going to get administratively or through surveys. And it creates generalizable data. So in terms of apples to apples comparisons, it's always going to be much easier with quantitative data. And then your analysis is going to create things like the charts and the graphs and the data visualizations. So this is just a few other options for qualitative methods in addition to interviews. There's oral history, which is really great if you're, for example, working in things like land or with farmers, like situations where somebody has an incredible story and you want to capture it from the beginning. Participant observation is also a really easy thing to do. It's just if your organization has events, it's just attending the event and trying to observe everything that happens and then documenting it. So for example, like when we did participant observation in the innovation lab, one thing we did is we just got a group of staff together, went to a fresh food distribution, helped out, had conversations, and then sat down afterwards with one person taking notes and just kind of like every single thing we thought we had, conversation we had, thing we saw, and created this document that really told the story of what happened at that event. Focus groups are an opportunity to bring together group learning and group brainstorming. So just getting a group of people around a table. And then there's document analysis, which could be looking at anything from meeting minutes to web pages to promotional material. Photo voice is a really fun one. Especially if you're trying to collect images, you can give things like I mean, it used to be that you would give disposable cameras. You can still do that. You can also do it through phones. Is just get people who are on the receiving end of programming to take pictures. A lot of the time in food work, this is what's done with Photo Voice, is asking people to go home and take pictures of their kitchen, pictures of the meals they're preparing, and then you get that data of like really seeing what people's lives are like.
Can
And
I
then
ask a question?
Yeah,
Sorry, this is
please.
kind of is Photo Voice the name of an app, or is it just kind of the general
No,
terminology for
yeah.
like having people add voice by submitting photos?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's not, I'm sure there is an app. I paused for a second, so I was like,
It could be.
they're
Okay.
better. If not, one of us should develop that right this minute. But yeah, it's just like as opposed to like using your voice in
Yeah,
interviews.
Okay.
Yeah, and then open-ended survey questions is the easiest, least time-consuming way to get qualitative results. I love this quote. Michael Quinn Patton is kind of one of the big people in qualitative research. And he says qualitative interviewing begins with the assumption that the perspective of others is meaningful, knowable, and able to be made explicit. I forgot the commas in that, but yeah, so I really think there's an incredible wisdom in people and human experience. And I don't know if you've ever had a conversation where you come up with new ideas in the conversation, or you integrate an experience through a conversation. I think there's a real magic to it that, you know, can be extremely valuable for understanding what your organization is doing in the world. Quantitative methodology, I mean, usually this is going to be, if you're getting it from other people, quantitative information, surveys is the way that it's usually done. And some of the things you might ask in a survey is yes, no questions. Likert scales are a really great way of doing quantitative assessment, which I'm sure all of you have done that before. It's anything where you're given a scale of 1 to 5, agree or disagree, or all the time and never. So it's like a scale in which you fill out along a spectrum, along a series of questions. In terms of programmatic data, again, these are things that maybe you're already collecting, or they're things you could decide to collect. Hopefully you're, you know, keeping track of costs, but also things like people and places served, quantities of product. Again, like tons of food is huge in food waste and food distribution. Miles is another important one, especially there's a lot of cool things you can do with mapping. If you're finding out how many miles you're traveling to either deliver services or people traveling to you. And there's a lot of existing measurement tools out there. And this is, you know, if you're going deep into quantitative methods, you really don't need to reinvent the wheel. And also when it comes back to apples comparisons, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. If you're interested, for example, in the level of food security in the population that you're interviewing, you don't want to make up questions, because the USDA came up with incredible questions that have been used across studies for decades now. So, and they have a 6-question food security, questionnaire that you can give, and then you can compare it to county-wide rates, statewide rates, nationwide rates. And another one that we've used that I really liked is there's a functional limitation questionnaire, which is a great way to assess ability in the population that you are talking to. So, you know, it's just about like, it asks questions about like, you know, how heavy can you pick up heavy things? Can you bend over? How is your eyesight? That kind of gets at people's, yeah, just their, like, if they have any functional limitations. And then there is just the existing data out there, which, you know, what we use in the lab a lot is the American Community Survey, which is put together by the Census Bureau. It's, again, like one of the most reliable surveys in the world. And it's, you can, you know, dig into that website and you can find all sorts of information on your community, which is important because sometimes when people are doing assessments, they come up with questions and some of these questions might be answered already. So you don't need to waste your organization's time. Okay, but you are going to want to craft some questions. So when you're crafting questions, some of the things you're going to want to think about are just like how specific they can be. The strategic goals of an organization are very broad and values-based, but if you ask someone a question about values, everyone has different definitions in their head of what those values mean. For example, your organization might say something about equity. You don't want to ask questions about equity because that's a broad topic, but maybe you want to ask a very specific question about, did you feel something was fair? Or were you like, what did you, or qualitative, like, what did you feel coming out of this experience? Things that you can look for equity within the answers to, without posing like a philosophical question to someone that they can kind of ponder and everyone will have a totally different answer from each other. Avoiding overlap is really important because of the second point that you do want, if you're doing interviews and surveys, you do want to keep them short. It's so tempting to come up with a million questions to ask, but most people don't want to answer a million questions, and you'll get better, more thoughtful responses if you keep it short. And then it's best practice to compensate people for their time if you're using their time to, you know, to gather assessment data. Something I've been thinking about a lot is this idea of the gratitude tax, which I think is very something we have to really keep in mind in nonprofits, which is the idea that if we're doing something good for someone, if we're doing something, if we're helping someone in some way, and we're not asking for money in exchange, people often feel like the only thing they can give back is gratitude. And that skews a lot of our data when we're trying to assess programs, because it's just like normal, you know, cultural competency to say thank you and to be grateful for things. And so it's just something to keep in mind when you are doing assessment, especially if you're working with populations who might be underserved and then you're giving direct service to them. You don't want to create a situation where you're just kind of patting yourself on the back because you're helping people who aren't, who are, you know, have gratitude for you. Okay, so you've done your assessment, you've done your surveys, you've looked at your administrative data, you've interviewed people, whatever you've chosen to do, you've crafted beautiful questions, you've got all these answers. The next step is, well, the first is the data collection plan. So how are you collecting data? And again, this is really important to think about in terms of capacity. You can, like, best practice in qualitative research is that you record interviews, you transcribe interviews, you reread the interviews, and you code them for emergent themes. It's incredibly time intensive. And maybe you just don't have the capacity for that, and that's fine. You can do things like you can record audio and then you can listen back to the audio, or you can not record audio and have somebody take notes. ideally a second person. So just really important when you're doing the collection to think about capacity. You don't want to create so much data that there's not going to be anybody who has the time to look through it all. You might want to record people's real voices in order to say have audio clips to share. If you're doing that, or any time you might be using someone's voice, their name, their identifying information, it's very important to get clear consent and permission for that. Because you don't want to, again, get somebody giving a beautiful quote. You have like a great multimedia clip, you put it on your website, and then it turns out that person was not comfortable with it being shared. Paper surveys versus digital surveys is another thing to consider. If you have a digital survey, it's so easy to use things like SurveyMonkey or Google Forms and create all of the charts and graphs you need. But different populations require paper surveys sometimes, especially if it's like an in-person event. And just thinking through that, because if you have a paper survey, you're going to need someone to put all that data in. Like something we've done in the past is had digital surveys and then had paper versions as well. And then we just have a staff person who goes on the digital survey site and essentially takes the survey over and over again in order to input all the paper. And just another word about consent. I mean, it's always important with anyone you're speaking with, for them to give clear consent. And for you to be clear with them about how their information is going to be used. And for example, if you can assure someone's anonymity, they might have more critical things. They might be less inclined to lean on that kind of gratitude tax. Because if it's really clear to them, no one will ever know you're the one who said this, you might get more honesty. Yeah, and also just to have the plan in advance, because you don't want to end up down the line and have to backtrack and try to get people to consent for something they already did. Okay, so then you have all your data and you're going to go back and analyze it. Now, for qualitative data, we often say that the researcher is the instrument. And this is something that all of us have the capacity to do, which is to recognize patterns in data, whether they be, like you talk to 20 people, the emergent themes will usually be pretty obvious. And you can go back and you can do a formalized coding pattern, or you can say something like, a lot of people talked about transportation issues. And then you could go back and see, like, what were the things people said about transportation? You can also use coding software. There's so many options out there now, especially with AI. You can, if you have written transcripts, you can look for specific words or phrases. You can use AI to pick up patterns in written things, but also just, as I said before, by putting things into a survey engine, like a SurveyMonkey or a Google Forms, those things are free tools and they do a lot of the analysis for you. So, you shouldn't shy away from that. And then once you've done your analysis, you're going to report your data. And this can be the grant report, the annual report, the internal programmatic retreat in which you share these outcomes and then decide how your program is going to operate differently or the same in the next year. And you're going to have several elements, one being the narrative, the story, what have you learned? And also the stories of people impacted by programs, quotes, it's great to have direct quotes. I'm sure anyone who's done an annual report or newsletters or things like that for your organization, it's just incredible value to just hear in people's own words. Multimedia is also really great, especially if you're using a website. It can be a really dynamic experience if you have things like audio, photo, or even video clips. And then data visualizations, which are just the ways that we take our numbers and we make them into something that is visible to people. The simpler, the better. So that, I have a typo there. It should just say admin data. Really, the less you, when you show a chart or a graph, the title should always say what you want people to take away from it. Like the title of a graph being like one that I was just showing in a presentation today was like, the majority of CSFP participants have live with disability. Just like, that's the thing that you're supposed to get. Put it right. Some people have chart anxiety where they look at a chart and their brain stops working. So just saying what you want them to get out of it in the title, keeping it as simple as possible. And then lastly, is like, what's the point of all of this if it's not if it's not to improve, to change over time? So call back to my slide about advisory boards. You know, the more people you can have engaged in the process of assessment, the better, because there is a danger of kind of navel gazing, somebody who's like deep into the work. They can't see the same things that people outside of it can see, and they also will be inherently biased towards what they want the program to be, or what they think is great about the program. So the more people involved in the assessment process, the better. And, you know, this can just be, this can be as minimal as having people review documents or assessment plans in one meeting a year and then getting reports in one other meeting a year. Or it could be as involved as like having a team of folks who are all doing it. There also needs to be a formal review. You'd be surprised that some boards don't read assessment reports, but I think it's really important in organizations to push the board of directors to be, to hear the assessment, for the program staff to hear the assessment, for everybody in the organization to have a culture of, again, like, so much effort goes into assessment, especially when it's for a grant. And it's sad to me when all that work goes into understanding what an organization's doing and then no one at the organization takes the time to read it. But ideally this is just one part of a whole organization process in the context of strategic planning, that you've done this assessment over time, and that when you're revisiting the strategic plan as an organization, this assessment data comes into conversation with it. And lastly, if you're trying to create this culture of data-driven transformation, it can be really a great way of responding to external factors such as funding changes or emergent community needs or changes in organizational priorities, that this assessment data can guide these big questions by providing context. Okay, that was a lot of me talking. So I want to pass this out. And what I did was I just made a bunch of questions, because really I think key to this process is just like asking yourself a bunch of questions and then answering them. And we've got a pretty small group here today. But maybe I'll pause for a second and see if anyone has any kind of questions, things you want me to go back to, clarifications on kind of that big presentation.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there like, I'm just curious, like, is there, in terms of like best practices around qualitative data, is there like a certain, you know, threshold that you're trying to reach in terms of like percentage base of, or like a number, like to make a survey or something really, something that you can say it's like actually qualitative and not just like one anecdotal story? Like, what is that? Like,
Yeah. Totally. And, you know, you could go, there's not like a clear best practice. I mean, in terms of qualitative research, the point is depth. And so, you don't need a lot. Generally, between like, what's like, like a good interview set would be 15 to 20 people. 20 is actually a lot if you're doing long form interviews, or one focus group that includes like 5 to 8 people. But the way that I prefer to do it is to have a mixed methods approach, because then you have data triangulating. So you get a really good story, for example, from one person that is, you know, that it's accurate if it also corresponds to something that they say corresponds to, you know, 57% of survey respondents said this, and then this person's telling a story about it. And so they complement each other, because I think one of the dangers is that when we're doing qualitative work, we have to not make universal claims. So that's why I can't give you a clear answer, because the goal is that you wouldn't say this one person's experience represents the population.
Yeah.
You could say this number represents the population, but in terms of interviews, that more like colors and humanizes and you know, what would be great is if you had as diverse a group as possible. So, you know, even if you're only interviewing like 3 or 4 people, but they're in different towns or different ages or different like race or gender identities, the more diversity, the better.
That's a question. Rachel has a question from the audience.
That I really like the kind of like triangulating data across different methods. That makes a lot of sense. I guess I'm curious, and this answer is probably multifold, but how are these program assessments manifesting? Like, what does the final outcome or product look like, or maybe we're getting to that. Maybe I'm jumping ahead, but.
No, you're not jumping ahead. For me personally, in the work that I do, we're doing ours twofold. So we're doing public reports that are just sort of like summaries of what we did and some of the main takeaways that's with an audience of kind of nonprofit organizations at large to kind of learn about what we learned and what we did. And then we're going into a second phase in the fall where we're taking all of our assessment data and we're turning it into specific recommendations internally for the Vermont Food Bank. And so, yeah, so that's what we're doing, is like a public facing and an internal facing. And then the internal facing, we could use programmatic data. We can talk about budgets. But the external facing is just, you know, kind of an opportunity for everyone to learn. And an annual report is kind of doing both of those things at once. So it just really depends on, you could do it in any imaginable way. I know you were, Rachel, were you the person who was talking about like, you didn't want to do an annual report because that's like kind of too much, but you were trying to figure out. Oops, oh wait, you're unmuted.
Yes, correct, because I'm perhaps the single compensated person in my prospective enterprise. So, and this is like my addition to my 9 to 5, basically. So an annual report seems a little ambitious, I would say.
Yeah, but it could be a slide deck. It could be even like a blog series on the organization website if you have one. I think the most important question is, do you want it to who your audience is? And your audience could really be anyone. An important distinction is internal to the organization, public. And then if it's the public, it's, things like, do you have advocacy aims? Are you trying to reach legislators? Are you trying to reach community members? Are you trying to reach peer organizations? And so like really understanding audience is what's going to answer that question of, what kind of reporting you're going to do.
One thing we do, we're super small, no compensated staff. And the way we do it is we just do a one-page break, and it's a mixture of statistics and narrative. Just kind of restating our mission statement and what we do and how we do it, and then making sure we include information on how many people served. Because part of the goal in reporting out for us is having the organization or the community understand what the need is. And it's reflected in the numbers of people that we serve. So that's one way that we've done reporting.
And a huge plug for one-page reports, because especially if your audience is anyone other than people who are in nonprofits, most people aren't gonna go past the first page. There are also some really beautiful, like the Center for Whole Communities example of an organization that works with artists in doing their annual reports, just to tell the story in a really visually enticing and beautiful way. Any other? Okay, I would really like, if folks want to just like dig into this, assessment planning worksheet. It's not something that you're going to necessarily finish in the next, 30 minutes. We go to 3:30?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, in the next 30 minutes, but I thought maybe we could take like a 20 minutes or so. And also, feel free to use a bio break in there. And I'm also happy to chat with people one-on-one, but just to start filling this out and almost as a way of just knowing, like, what do you know and what do you don't know? What are the big questions that you have to go back to your organization with? Or is there a person in particular you have to shoot an email to and ask about the assessment process?
And if anyone online wants to chat one-on-one too, just kind of great, I'll keep an eye. But if you want to talk directly with her, if it prompts questions. We can just slide the laptop closer.
Yeah. And also, like, everyone has different learning styles, so I'm also available for emailing or even setting up a conversation later if you need to process before the questions really come up. Oh, do you need a pen?
I think I do, I think I like ran out of the office. So I know. Actually, there's a whole bunch. Oh, okay.
Let's just do 20 minutes.
Just a note, Shelby said she has to log off early, but thank you so much. And she's looking forward to listening to the rest of what we talk about and sees what comes up for folks.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is like kind of over the scale of like where we're at, for, you know, for my group, but I think others as well, but. Yeah, it's great to like have that point too, that like a year report can also be like a page or like a series of blog posts. And I think that's really interesting, like thinking about what is the best way to reach folks, especially if it's not policymakers as much as just community members to engage folks and yeah, engagement voters, which is part of who we're trying to reach.
So would you say that farmers is your main audience?
Yeah, farmers and just the community members in general.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we're really trying to network farmers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's hard and definitely thought of like, yeah, a survey. The digital survey only goes so
Mhm, yeah,
like
yeah.
getting farmers, you know, to come to events is challenging.
Especially in growing season.
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
Actually just had to bump. I don't know who wrote this into the grant, but they were planning to do originally an evaluation. This is a project that I picked up that had already started. Planning to do an evaluation with farmers, sort of like a feedback on a program in September. I was like, what? That is not a good, so we're trying to bump that timeline out into it. In like December,
Well,
and for focus groups, and just kind of
Yeah,
really give people a chance to really like have time to reflect and be, otherwise, if you get a response, it's like. Yeah, I think it's just too much to, so I think it's really important to think about, like, when you're doing any kind of assessment, like. The folks you're trying to reach and like timing can be really important when you're coming up with any kind of plan.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't find myself capable of like any reflective
Yeah.
activity at all in the month of July.
Yeah.
That's why I'm so glad it's over.
Yeah, there's also survey fatigue, which is a real thing, there's just so many surveys floating around and, yeah, we, had a situation happen where we were like trying to get a survey and the response rate was really low and it turned out that the population just had received, like almost this exact population had received another survey a few weeks before. And it's just like,
Yeah.
that's, when you have to kind of change tact. When I did my dissertation research on farmers and did qualitative interviews. And the method that I did was that I would work on the farm, like I would do harvesting for a couple days and just sort of earn my keep for an hour of interview time.
Mhm.
So it felt like a little more of an exchange. But yeah. No, farmers are one of the hardest populations to. They're just interesting because one of the reasons I love farmers and the reason that I wrote my whole dissertation on them is because they are, as a group of people, incredibly reflective. And I think part of that is the nature of the work. That you're just like in your own head a little bit. And so,
That's interesting.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious, like, so in the instance of Pemaco is collective, like. If you like were to think about long-term kind of evaluation or assessment plan, like. Just on like the data side, like you have access to some data, right, like your membership, I'm just curious, like, what are the data pieces that you have access to, and then.
Yeah, I mean, like I sent out emails and so I can see all of the analytics from emails and websites and surveys. There's that,
Yeah.
yeah. I wouldn't say we've done like in-depth conversations, but that is in the works.
yeah. Yeah, and it's hard, yeah, there's like there's a tricky balance to be struck, and it's like, I don't think people want to be engaged by a survey also, and like, you know, want to yeah, do a little bit more than just check boxes, but then also just having everything like open-ended. Especially when we don't really have the capacity to go around and like have these conversations with people individually, so like, yeah, how to really reach people. I mean, I love that idea of like spending a day
Yeah.
doing a little work trade.
Yeah, there's something that, yeah,
Right.
you can do when you're a graduate student.
Yeah, but I mean, that is like, I think. You know, there's something that we've seen to be like the most impactful is having farmers connect to each other on someone else's farm, like that, a working farm, and that's a really
Yeah.
good way to like get folks to come out to an event.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm curious, when you talk about networking, what kind of the underlying, like, how would you, like, what would be the qualities of a strong network? Like, how would the network reflect your success?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think that I think that's looking at more like qualitative data, like how is a community like welcoming new farmers, like how are farmers, you know, interacting with each other, and what are their relationships in the community, like how they basically, like how well do farmers know each other and communicate.
Feel
Um,
supported kind of by a community.
and that as well, yeah, how well do folks in the community recognize and know where to go to access local food? Which is just not as, yeah, that network is not as well developed specifically in our region.
Yeah,
Yeah,
isn't the Curious Card Food Hub, is that in,
Here's
pretty far from us.
that's far from you?
It's
Yeah.
one of the hubs, so like Feed
Oh,
Kearsarge,
okay.
which Kearsarge Food Hub is one of the.
And
main
Claremont
partners.
is,
Yeah, like
a little
half
bit.
an hour from,
Okay,
I don't know, well,
Yeah.
they're in Bradford, so
mm-hmm,
something like that, but
yeah.
yeah, so we're kind of like working towards that,
Mm-hmm.
becoming food hub.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay, you named so many different goals. When you were talking, you named like, new farmers, like new people coming into farming. And their ability to be successful, and then you named, existing farmers. And their kind of, almost like their, mutual aid and support networks, like how many other farmers are connected to each farmer. Yeah.
Well, and this is like, these are offshoots of what I see from a farmer's network. I don't necessarily, like, new farmers, for example, is not necessarily a focus of our group
Mhm.
at the moment.
Yeah. But then Food Hub, that's like a huge infrastructure sort of project.
Yeah, like, for, you know, slowly
Yeah,
seeing what will happen.
no, I like it. Seems like I can see like the vision through those different things of like the kind of community goal that you have there for like a rural agricultural community. Yeah. So it seems like how long have you been operating?
Yeah, I think we first started conversations in like 2021,
Mhm.
but started out with just like a group of folks having potluck essentially.
Yeah. It's great. Yeah, it seems like you,
And working on each
Yeah.
other's farms a little bit.
yeah, yeah. I can almost see it, like, I wonder if there is a way to, tell that story through like the image of a network, like if you could like, and this is just, I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but if you could have like the number of farms that started like at that potluck, and then over the, like every year, just see like how many more farms, how big an area, how many times, like just have a few things that like there could almost be like, if you could pictorially represent it, seems like the goal for it would be for it to get larger, but also more intricate.
Yeah,
over
absolutely.
time.
I mean, we have like an online map of our members and that's been growing. each
Yeah.
year. The area itself is pretty defined, trying to keep it as local as possible, just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you use for your online map?
Topical. Google Maps.
Yeah.
Currently, but I think we're getting some help to like, I think we'll be shifting away from that, but yeah. It's just trying to increase the functionality a bit
Yeah,
more. It's been challenging with that.
mapping is challenging for
Mhm.
sure. But yeah,
I was gonna say, I think you're like the participant observation, I think that's the one when you were talking about your team sort of at an event. Kind of in that time bound moment. Took a little bit of extra time at the end to kind of reflect back with each other, the things that they heard and connect, like all of the things that we're noticing and like captured all of that information and used that as part of a qualitative data set. I feel like. That might be something within reach for for grassroots groups to just be able to. Maybe build that into events, because I don't think that, I've never specifically built that into an event in quite the same way, but I do it in my own head, but it would
Yeah.
be good to be intentional about it. And like build out a little extra time after an event to do that, because I think that there's a lot that happens in the moment that's quite valuable and. It often does get lost in the moment, and so I think that is. Anyway, to
It
me,
really-
that feels doable and.
it really is just taking an hour or so to either have a conversation where one person's taking notes or even by yourself.
Yeah.
So like really that intentional of like, I'm gonna do this event and then I'm going to, instead of decompressing or driving home or talking to the people afterwards, I'm gonna sit down and just like get as much as I can down.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that, we have debrief sessions after an event and take notes, but then. I don't necessarily know what comes of that. I mean, sometimes there's a really clear thing like, oh, next time we should have this. right? Or do this. But then there's a lot of times where like, oh, what to do about this thing? I feel like that falls through the cracks because we're not necessarily going back and like reading.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Over every. No.
Yeah, I mean, that is, as you know, I think that there's a lot of new functionality with AI in terms of like, if
Yeah.
all those notes are typed up.
That's one of the things, yeah, that I was thinking about during your presentation. I was like, what could make my life easier?
Yeah.
I mean, like, and like more expensive potentially, but like.
I was actually at a retreat for another organization this winter. And in order for everybody to participate, they set up some thing that just heard everything that we were saying and then was able to transcribe it as we went along. And we could see it on the screen. They had a big screen up and we could see the transcription in real time.
Oh.
Which was great. It didn't, like, it wasn't completely there yet, but because, different people talk, so how does it recognize different voices? And so there's still some work to do on that, but it was interesting to have that because you could say, wait, actually, that's not what I meant. This is what I meant. And yeah, so it's kind of cool. It's kind of wild.
Yeah.
No. I
Really,
mean, it's great because it allows everybody to participate instead of being worried about taking notes.
Mhm.
Because I think that kind of like removes you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, because you're focused, it's hard to focus on both things. As much as we like to think we can multitask.
Yeah, no, I've made the mistake of facilitating a meeting and then also thinking I was gonna take notes and you just, you
Yeah.
can't do both.
Also, is that a thing though? That seems like a thing that could be easily available, meeting minute taker.
Yeah. I think Zoom has a tool within it.
within Zoom, there's a
I'm
tool?
pretty sure.
Yeah.
That's great, Rachel's nodding, yeah.
You
Yes.
just eliminated your
There
job.
is
Something
yeah.
that I don't even know. Yeah.
Yeah,
But yeah, that's.
I mean, I know about Otter, but that's. a
Yeah,
subscription service.
Right.
we pay for Otter for our, just because we do so many interviews. And it doesn't get it quite perfect, but it gets enough that
Yeah.
when you see a quote where like maybe a word or two is wrong, you can go back and listen to get that quote right. But yeah, it's pretty crazy. Yeah, you can use Otter to transcribe, and then you can use other subscription services to like actually go through the transcription and be like, what are the main ideas? Things like that. I haven't gone to that level yet.
Hmm.
Part of me is resisting that. I still want to feel useful.
Rachel just sent the AI plugin link for Zoom. That is a very long link, you're right, Rachel.
I know.
It's making me long, but cool. Okay. Yeah. I guess I'm curious if like anybody's using any of these methods already at the hub level, because I know, I mean. A lot of the hubs are all volunteer power. I'm just curious if it's happening.
You mean in terms of like transcription and that sort of thing, or?
Yeah, and like, you know, do you do surveys? Like, I don't even fully, I mean, I know.
So one of the things, so what we do is we have people sign up, do a reservation. So we have a Google form for that, that link goes out every month. And then, people sign up, that way we order just what we need. And when they sign up with Google Docs, you can also create a Google Sheet.
Yeah.
And so the results from that set up the questions so that I can easily take the information that I need and then because I'm bad at math, it adds up the total number that I need, but it also collects that data like, how many households, how many people, and how many grocery bags.
Mhm.
And that's all the data we create right now.
Yeah.
Because we're a small community, we know everybody.
Yeah.
So.
So I am curious to specifically around, this like page 2 stuff.
On the handout.
On the handout, sorry, page 2 on the handout. Just this process of going from a goal to, a guiding question for assessment to a specific question that you would ask someone. I'm curious if anyone has an example of that kind of like drilling down process. Or if you wanna toss out something and be like, see if the group hive mind can work through it.
So I can actually share how we started, and it started with community assessment. We wanted to do something, but we didn't know where to start. Because there was already a food shop in town. But people were leaving town to access food rather than using the food shop. And so, luckily I work with a lot of food systems students. So they needed a job over the summer because it was COVID and they couldn't go out and work. And so I was able to leverage some money that was available through the school to hire them to do the assessment work. But the board of directors, such as we were the advisory committee. And what we did was develop a model of community members and ambassadors. And ambassadors is what we call people who work with social service agencies and could then help us gather information by leading us to people that we should talk to about needs. And then the students also connected with UVM for the context of the work that they were doing. So there was a researcher, I'm sure you know her name, and I can't remember her name, but she was doing a lot of work on food access in COVID.
Or Meredith.
Yes, so they contacted Meredith,
Mhm.
they worked with her, they developed some questions, they used the USDA questions. And they used a lot of available data from census and USDA and demographic data that's already available regarding median income, all that stuff. So then when we got to the point where we were talking to community members, it was just, we were just asking them questions about their ability to access food. Rather than like those invasive questions, because we were their fellow community members, and that was gonna be awkward. So we offered them anonymity if they wanted it. Some chose to do a digital survey. We offered the opportunity to get a gift card for groceries. And we also kind of employed like all these ambassadors and these students to actually do more targeted telephone calls after we did the initial round of surveys. And the surveys were also paper and in addition to digital. QR codes are a beautiful thing. It's so easy to get that information out and people don't have to stop and download it and everything.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's essentially how we started.
I love that. Have you considered returning to that? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and that report is actually lives on the Vermont Law website.
Oh, nice.
So,
Yeah. Well, we're getting towards the end of our time, and one thing I would just love maybe if we could just do one more kind of go around about just like one, because at the core, this is just like the point is to push yourself to be a little more reflexive than you have been. And so this is a group of very reflective people and who are doing reflective work in your organizations already. And I'm just curious to hear kind of just as you move forward out of this workshop, you know, back home and end of your day, and then it's Friday, like what's one thing that you would like to say out loud in terms of your own personal accountability that you could, you know, take one step in order to bring a little more of that reflexivity into your organization, some action that you might feel like you could take?
I feel like I could speak on like different kind of project areas, both for us, like assessing UVRN as a project, but I think one thing that I'm really interested in continuing on is like what you were talking about is finding ways to kind of help support mostly like volunteer-led organizations, find ways to effectively like track some of that data, because like I guess, yeah, exploring beyond kind of the traditional conventional ways we think of doing that, that are not feasible for a number of people that are already putting in extra work with time that they don't have to a project. So I'm really interested in continuing to think about that, and like you said, think about things that make your life easier, right? I have some beginnings of thoughts, so I'm excited to like follow back up with that.
Yeah, to that point, it was a reminder to me to, input my handwritten surveys into Google Form. That's been on my list for a couple weeks, and, also, yeah, maybe ask my brother-in-law who works in AI if there's some kind of like meeting minute taking.
Yeah,
Cause I do think that's something that like weirdly like holds up our meetings so much.
yeah,
Is, yeah, trying to have a small group of people talk and all be contributing
yeah,
and able to contribute and then also like boiling down the takeaways, right?
yeah.
Rachel, you were gonna say something.
Yes, maybe a couple of things. One thing that well, I think this got me thinking about a lot of like different ideas, for example, different note-taking strategies. That would not be so much extra work. I think the thing that is intimidating about this is like, oh God, like program assessment is like when you're already spending so much effort, kind of like maxed out doing the programs themselves, then following up the assessment, that can be the challenging piece, I guess. But I think there were some tactics shared today to kind of help minimize the load, but still be like collecting good feedback. So keeping like those tactics in mind. And then just one thing that I'm like currently working on is kind of reflecting what folks are saying earlier about farmers being really hard to track down and not having a lot of time and bandwidth. I'm like finding a little bit of the same thing with my hub representatives, or like member organization representatives. But I think, and like a big potluck wasn't quite the scene that worked best for people's schedules. So instead, I'm kind of meeting one-on-one with folks. And I think just as I'm continuing that process, doing more intentional data gathering. I think I've been taking notes, but it's not been so structured thus far, and I'm maybe like a third of the way in. So I think just thinking about how to make that be a little bit more cohesive. I think at this point, the level of program assessment is with those like member org representatives, not with all the members of the organizations themselves, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I I had a workshop yesterday at work on receiving feedback, so this kind of feels like it fits right into that. Because sometimes feedback is difficult if your program isn't working the way you intended it to. So, that's kind of something that just connected for me.
I think for me, it's like trying to think about kind of right sizing was the word you used, and I think that that is really important because I think sometimes we think it has to be this like giant, big, massive thing, and then it's just like, and then sometimes it just doesn't even happen because it's impossible, and you lose steam or yeah, I think sort of like being really thoughtful about how it's built in and whether it's right sized. Yeah, and I think that can apply to all levels of, grassroots groups, nonprofits that have too much going on, whatever it is, like all of it. I think it's, yeah.
I love it when I see, like a company, if I buy something online and just they take you to a page where there's just like a smile and a flat face and a frown. And they're just like, just real quick. what was your experience? And you just like click one button, but just imagine the amount of data that they're getting from so many people clicking one button. And I think that's a really important lesson, that like we can have little tiny things that we do that are really easy and people don't even think about it, that could give us incredible amounts of information. Yeah, well, thank you everyone for having me today. I am available, and it's that moment where I don't know if I brought cards or not. But
Well, we can definitely put it in
yeah,
your contact info.
Yeah.
It's really okay.
okay, cool. 'Cause, yeah, I have like someone else's card.
Little
Little business cards too.
Cause I have them and I don't ever know how to use them. People, I just email people.
We put
Yeah.
hands up too.
Oh, okay, yeah.
We had a reunion, earlier this summer, and I have all these grad students, and I was like, you need to go and connect with alums, and they were like, well, so. But how do I get their information? I'm like, well, let's make you some business cards, and they're like, business cards. It's like, oh, right. I was like, well, you're gonna be dealing with a lot of boomers and Gen Xers, so
Yeah.
you need
Yeah.
a business.
Yeah.
Rachel's your hand up for.
It is, it's unrelated, but I have an announcement, slash little plug. Apple Corps, which I coordinate and is one of the member organizations of the Hartford Hub, has some fruit trees that are outside of the Hartford Town Hall, which is right across the street from where you all are. Basically, I can drop a link in the chat if that's helpful, but, and the fruit is getting ripe. There's a bunch of apples and pears. There's like 4 trees just right in front of the town hall. So if you've got a couple extra minutes after this and you want some delicious fresh fruit, please stop by.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, so don't hesitate to reach out too if you want to brainstorm anything or questions that come up later. But thank you all so much.
Thank you.